The eviction notice sat heavy on June Marlowe's bookstore counter, the official Hale Properties letterhead crisp and unforgiving. Rain streaked the large front windows of Page Turner's, the used bookstore her grandmother had opened 40 years ago, and the scent of old paper and damp wool hung in the air. At 30, June had poured every dollar, every late night, every piece of herself into this shop. And now, in 90 days, it would be bulldozed for luxury condos. The bell above the door jingled at 4:30, sharp in the quiet shop. June looked up, expecting her best friend Lila with coffee. Instead, a man stood in the doorway, rain dripping off the hem of his charcoal overcoat, his expression as cold as the December wind outside. She recognized him immediately. Caleb Hale, 34, CEO of Hale Properties, the man signing her eviction papers. Portland's real estate circles talked about him like he was a robot in a tailored suit, all numbers, no heart. "Miss Marlowe," he said, stepping inside. He didn't bother with small talk. He laid a second folder on the counter, right next to the eviction notice. "I have a counterproposal." June crossed her arms. "I'm not interested in a buyout." "I'm not selling. It's not a buyout." He flipped open the folder. "My grandmother owned this building for 50 years. Before she died last month, she left a codicil in her will. To take full control of this property and move forward with the development, I have to present a committed long-term partner to the family trust. A fiancé by the end of the month." June stared at him. "Okay, congratulations. Go find one." "What does that have to do with my bookstore?" 30 days, he said, his dark eyes steady on hers. "You pretend to be my fiancé for 30 days. You come to 2 family dinners, meet the trust lawyer, pose for a few photos, and sell the story. At the end of the 30 days, I sign you into a permanent 15-year lease at 80% below market rate. The bookstore stays, forever, as far as you're concerned." The shop went quiet, save for the patter of rain on the window. June laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. "Are you serious?" she said. "You want me to fake engage you to trick your dead grandma's trust? That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. This is a bluff. You're just trying to pressure me into leaving." Caleb didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He slid a second piece of paper across the counter, a draft contract, already typed up, every term laid out clearly. No hidden fine print, no traps. Exactly what he'd said. "It's not a bluff," he said. "I don't bluff. I have 3 weeks to find someone. You're the only candidate who makes sense. You're from the neighborhood. You run a respected local business. You have no interest in my money or my last name. The trust will buy it, and you get to keep your store. Fair trade." June looked down at the contract. 15-year lease, below market rate. Her bookstore, safe. The same store her grandma had run, where she'd learned to read, where neighborhood kids came for story time every Saturday. She looked back up at him. He was handsome, in a sharp, unforgiving way. High cheekbones, a faint scar across his left eyebrow. The kind of man who was used to getting exactly what he wanted. She didn't trust him. Not even a little, but she also didn't have any other options. "Let me be clear," she said, leaning forward across the counter. "This is a business transaction. Nothing more. No dates, no affection beyond what's strictly necessary. No showing up at my shop unannounced outside of scheduled appearances. And if you so much as hint at anything real, I walk." "Agreed," he said immediately. He held out a hand. 30 days. "You keep the bookstore. I keep the development on track. No feelings, no mess." June stared at his hand for a long second. She thought he was cold. She thought this was a stupid, reckless plan. She thought there was no way it would actually work. But she also thought about her grandma. About the smell of old paper and lemon drops. About the kids who sat on the floor by the children's section every Saturday morning. She shook his hand. His palm was warm, his grip firm. 30 days, she said. "But if this blows up in my face, I'm blaming you." The corner of his mouth tugged up, just barely. "It won't blow up," he said. "Everything will go exactly according to plan." He left a few minutes later, leaving the contract and a schedule of upcoming events on the counter. June stared at the papers long after the door had clicked shut behind him. The rain kept falling. The old books sat quiet on their shelves. And for the first time all week, she let herself hope the store might actually survive. She thought it was just a deal. Just a weird, awkward business arrangement with a guy she didn't like. She had no idea that by the end of the 30 days, the bookstore wouldn't be the only thing she was afraid to lose. The first family dinner was 3 days later, at Caleb's parents' house in the West Hills. June showed up in a simple dark green dress, her hair pulled back, a cheap fake engagement ring on her finger that he'd dropped off the day before. It felt like a costume. She felt like an imposter. Caleb met her at the front door. His tie loosened just a little, and for half a second, he looked almost nervous. "Remember the story," he said, low, as he helped her off with her coat. "We met at a neighborhood preservation meeting 3 months ago. We kept it quiet because of the development. We got engaged last week. Keep it simple. Don't overshare." "Got it," June said. "Lie to your family for you. Check." He frowned. "It's not lying. It's strategic omission." June rolled her eyes. "Sure it is." Dinner was far less terrible than she expected. Caleb's mother was warm, if a little overwhelming, and his father asked thoughtful questions about the bookstore. The only sharp edge was Mr. Torres, the family trust lawyer, a quiet man with silver hair and watchful eyes. He asked her about their first date, about how often they saw each other, about her plans for the bookstore long-term. June answered steadily, sticking to their script, and Caleb backed her up every time. Halfway through dessert, Caleb's mother smiled and said, "You know, Caleb hasn't brought anyone home since college. I was starting to think he'd marry his spreadsheets." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Mom, it's true," she said, turning to June. "He's always been so serious. All work, no fun. His grandma used to say he needed someone to pull him out of his office, someone who cared about more than just bottom lines." June glanced at Caleb. He was staring down at his plate, his jaw tight. And for a second, she didn't see the cold developer everyone talked about. She saw a guy who'd been carrying the weight of his family's company for a long time. "He's not all work," she said, before she could stop herself. "He cares about the neighborhood, too. That's why we met. He doesn't just want to build condos. He wants to keep the heart of the area alive." Caleb looked up at her, surprised. Something soft flickered in his dark eyes, gone almost as fast as it appeared. After dinner, they walked out onto the back patio to get some air. The city lights sparkled below them, and the air smelled like pine and cold rain. "You didn't have to say that," Caleb said, leaning against the railing. "It was part of the story, right?" June said. "Good for the trust." He nodded, but he didn't look convinced. "For the record," he said quiet, "I do care. About the neighborhood. About this building. My grandma loved that bookstore. She used to take me there when I was a kid. That's why I didn't just bulldoze it the second I took over." June blinked. She'd never heard that. She'd always assumed he didn't care about anything but profit. "Why didn't you tell me that?" she said. He shrugged. "You didn't ask. You decided I was the bad guy before we even met." He was right. She had. And maybe she'd been wrong. They drove back to the city in silence. But it wasn't the tense silence it had been on the way there. It was softer, like something had shifted between them. He walked her to her apartment door, like a gentleman, and stopped on the landing. "Torres is suspicious," he said. "He's going to dig. He's going to show up at the bookstore, unannounced, to see if we're real. We need to be more careful. We need to look like a real couple when we're in public." "Okay," June said. "What do you suggest?" "For the next few weeks, you should come to the building site with me once a week. Get coffee together. Walk through the neighborhood. Let people see us. Make it look natural." June hesitated. More time together meant more risk of slipping up, more risk of feeling things she shouldn't, but it also meant a better chance of keeping the bookstore. "Fine," she said. "But you're buying the coffee." He smiled just a little. "Deal." He left a minute later. June leaned back against her front door, her heart beating a little faster than it should. She told herself it was just nerves, just the stress of lying to a room full of people. It wasn't because for half a second, when he'd smiled at her on the patio, she'd forgotten it was all fake. The next morning, she was restocking the poetry section when the bell jingled. She looked up, expecting a customer. It was Mr. Torres, the trust lawyer. He smiled politely, but his eyes were sharp. "Good morning, Miss Marlowe," he said. I thought I'd stop by, see the famous bookstore for myself, and maybe ask a few more questions about your engagement." June's stomach dropped. Caleb had been right. The test had only just begun. Mr. Torres stayed for almost an hour. He wandered the shelves, asked about the store's history, flipped through old photo albums June kept behind the counter, and asked a dozen small, careful questions about Caleb, his favorite food, how he liked his coffee, what he did on weekends. June answered as best she could, sticking to what she'd guessed, what she'd picked up at dinner, and prayed she didn't slip up. When he finally left, June collapsed onto the stool behind the counter, her hands shaking. She texted Caleb immediately. Torres showed up. "Close call," he replied 10 minutes later. "I warned you. Dinner at my place tomorrow. We need to practice, like this was a school play, not a fake engagement that could make or break her entire life." She showed up at his loft in the Pearl District the next night, a stack of takeout menus in hand. His place was sleek, modern, all floor-to-ceiling windows and neutral furniture, with barely a personal touch in sight. It looked like a hotel room, not a home. "Nice place," she said, setting the menus on the kitchen island. "Very human, very lived in." Caleb rolled his eyes. "I don't have time to decorate." Clearly. They ordered Thai food and sat at the island, going over the details of their fake life. Favorite movies, first trip together, inside jokes they could reference. It was tedious, it was silly, and it was surprisingly easy. He was funny, in a dry, quiet way, and he knew more about classic poetry than she expected, thanks to all those trips to her bookstore as a kid. Halfway through the night, she wandered over to his desk, where a stack of blueprints was spread out. She leaned in to look, and her blood ran cold. The plans showed the bookstore space, and it wasn't a bookstore anymore. It was labeled ground floor retail, coffee shop, and co-working. June stepped back like the paper had burned her. "You said the bookstore stays," she said, her voice tight. "You promised me a 15-year lease, but you're already planning to turn it into a coffee shop?" Caleb looked up, confused. Then he saw what she was looking at, and his face fell. "June, that's an old draft." "Old draft?" she said. She could feel anger rising in her chest, hot and sharp. "So this whole thing is a lie? You string me along for 30 days, get your trust approval, then kick me out anyway? Is that the plan?" "No," he said, standing up. "That's not it at all. That's the original plan from before my grandma's codicil. I haven't updated the drawings yet. The lease deal is real. I signed it already. It's in my office. Save it," she said. She grabbed her coat off the chair, her hands shaking. "I knew I couldn't trust you. I knew this was too good to be true. You're just like every other developer. All promises until you get what you want." "June, wait." She walked out before he could finish. The door slammed shut behind her, and she didn't look back. She walked all the way home in the cold December air, her eyes stinging, and told herself she was angry. Just angry, not hurt, not disappointed. Angry. She spent the next 2 days avoiding his calls and texts. She told herself she'd call off the whole deal. She'd find another way to save the bookstore. She'd sell the rare first editions, take out a loan, fight the eviction in court. Anything was better than being lied to. But deep down, she knew she didn't have another way. And deeper than that, she knew she wasn't just mad about the bookstore. She was mad because she'd started to like him. She'd started to think maybe he wasn't the bad guy after all. Mr. Torres left the envelope on the counter and walked out. June stood there for a long time, staring at it, her legs weak. All the hope she'd let herself feel over the past 2 weeks evaporated just like that. The bell jingled again a minute later. This time it was Caleb, breathless, like he'd run all the way from his office. He had a thick folder in his hand. "June, I'm sorry," he said immediately. "I should have shown you the updated plans sooner. I brought the final lease, signed and notarized. And the new blueprints? Look, the bookstore stays exactly where it is. The coffee shop is going in the empty space next door. I was gonna surprise you." He stopped when he saw her face, when he saw the manila envelope on the counter. "Torres was here," he said. "It wasn't a question." June nodded. "He knows. He's going to the trust tomorrow. It's over, Caleb. The deal's off. I lose the store. You lose the development. We both lose." Caleb's jaw tightened. He set his folder down on the counter and ran a hand through his hair. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked genuinely scared. "No," he said. "It's not over." "What are you going to do?" she said, bitter. "Lie more? Bribe him? It won't work. He has proof. He has texts, probably. He has the original contract we signed." "No," Caleb said. He looked up at her, his dark eyes steady. "We tell the truth." June stared at him. "What?" "We tell the trust the truth," he said. "We tell them it started as a deal, that I needed a partner to satisfy the codicil, that you needed to save your store. But then we tell them the rest." "The rest?" June said. Her heart was beating fast. "What rest?" He stepped closer to her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, close enough that she could see the faint scar above his eyebrow. "The rest is that it's not a deal anymore," he said. Quiet. "Not for me. These past 2 weeks, talking to you, walking through the neighborhood with you, hearing you talk about the bookstore like it's alive. I haven't cared about anything this much since I was a kid. Not just the store. You." June's breath caught. "I'm not good at this," he said, shaking his head a little. "I'm not good at feelings or people. But I know I don't want 30 days. I want more. I want the real thing. If you do..." The shop was quiet. Somewhere outside, a car drove past. Rain tapped against the window, the same way it had the day he'd walked in with his stupid proposal. June had spent the last 2 days telling herself she hated him, telling herself he was just another greedy developer, telling herself none of it was real. But standing there, looking at him, flustered, honest, actually trying, she knew it had been real for her too. "You really mean that?" she said, soft. "I really do," he said. She reached across the counter and took his hand. It was warm, just like it had been the day they shook on the deal. Only this time, it didn't feel like a business transaction. It felt like something real. "Okay," she said. "Then we tell them the truth, together." They spent the rest of the night going over everything. They laid out the original deal, the updated development plans, the permanent lease, their vision for the neighborhood, bookstore, coffee shop, affordable studio spaces above, all tied together by the history of the building. Caleb called the trust board that night and asked to speak at the meeting the next day. No excuses, no scripts, just the truth. June went home that night with a flutter in her chest she couldn't name. She still didn't know if they'd win. She still didn't know if the bookstore would survive. But for the first time, she didn't feel like she was doing it alone. The next morning, they walked into the trust board meeting side by side. Mr. Torres was already there, smug and confident, his evidence folder on the table. Caleb squeezed her hand. "Ready?" he said. June nodded. "Ready." Whatever happened next, they'd face it together. On the third day, the bell above the bookstore door jingled mid-afternoon. June looked up, ready to tell him to leave. It wasn't Caleb. It was Mr. Torres. He set a manila envelope on the counter. "I did some digging," he said, his voice quiet. "I know this engagement is fake, Miss Marlowe. I know about the deal, and I'm going to present my findings to the trust tomorrow. The development will be put on hold. And your lease? It will never happen." June's stomach dropped. All the air went out of the room. She'd lost. She'd lost the bookstore. She'd lost the deal. And somewhere along the way, she'd lost her heart too. The trust board meeting room smelled of polished wood and faint coffee, the kind of quiet, formal space where decisions that changed people's lives were made behind closed doors. June sat straight-backed in a leather chair, her hands folded in her lap, while Mr. Torres laid out his evidence one piece at a time. He was smooth, confident, clearly convinced he'd already won. He presented printed text messages, the original draft contract Caleb had left at the bookstore, even a statement from a restaurant server who'd overheard them arguing about lease terms. "This was never a relationship," Torres said, resting his hands on the table. "It was a transaction, a calculated attempt to circumvent the late Mrs. Hale's final wishes." Mr. Hale found a struggling small business owner, dangled a lease in front of her, and used her as a pawn. "That is not commitment. That is fraud." The 5 board members nodded, their expressions unreadable. June's throat felt tight. She glanced at Caleb beside her. His jaw was tight, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table, but he didn't look scared. He looked steady. When Torres finished, Caleb stood up. He didn't reach for a binder. He didn't call a witness. He just looked the board chairman in the eye and spoke plainly. "Every word Mr. Torres just said is true," he said. A soft murmur rippled through the room. Torres blinked, clearly thrown off script. "It started as a deal," Caleb went on. "I needed a committed partner to satisfy the codicil. Miss Marlowe needed to save her bookstore. I proposed 30 days of a fake engagement. I thought it would be clean, simple. A business arrangement, nothing more." He paused, then turned and looked at June. For a second, there was no one else in the room. "I was wrong," he said, quieter now. "It wasn't simple. It wasn't clean. Because somewhere between family dinners and walking through the neighborhood and arguing about blueprints until midnight, it stopped being fake for me. This isn't about satisfying a will anymore. It's about building something that lasts, something my grandmother would have been proud of." He laid the updated development plans on the table. The full-color renderings showed Page Turner's bookstore intact, its original brick facade restored, flanked by a small community coffee shop and affordable artist studios on the upper floors. "This isn't just another luxury condo building," he said. "It's a neighborhood hub. The bookstore stays, permanently, on a 15-year lease at below market rate, with an option to renew. The coffee shop will be run by a local owner. The studios will be reserved for local artists and writers at half the market rate. This is what my grandmother wanted. Not a trophy building, a place that matters." Then June stood up. Her hands were still a little shaky, but her voice was steady. She told them about her grandmother, about learning to read between the fiction shelves, about Saturday story time, and the retired teachers who volunteered, and the teenagers who hung out in the poetry section after school. She told them she'd agreed to the deal because she'd been desperate, because the store was the only home she'd ever really had. "And then it changed," she said. "He didn't just promise me a lease. He listened. He asked about my ideas for the community reading room. He remembered the names of my regulars. I went into this thinking he was just another developer who only cared about profit. I was wrong." She looked over at Caleb, and he was smiling, just a little. "It wasn't the start anyone would plan for," she said, turning back to the board. "But real things rarely start perfectly. They just become real." The board deliberated for 42 minutes. June and Caleb waited in the hallway, sitting side by side on a wooden bench. He didn't say anything. He just reached over and took her hand. His palm was warm, his grip firm, and for the first time all morning, she could breathe. When the chairman called them back in, his face gave nothing away. "The codicil requires a demonstrated long-term committed partnership," he said. "It does not dictate how that partnership must begin. What we have seen today is two people who started with an agreement and built something genuine. The development plan honors the spirit of Mrs. Hale's bequest, preservation of community, investment in local life, and a commitment that extends beyond profit." He paused. "The petition is approved. The lease is valid. Full control of the property transfers to Mr. Hale, effective immediately." The room settled into quiet order. Torres packed his papers without a word and left, his face tight with anger. The chairman shook their hands, wished them well, and said he looked forward to visiting the bookstore someday. They walked out of the building together into bright December sunlight. The sidewalk was dusted with leftover snow, and the air smelled like pine and roasted chestnuts from the cart down the block. Caleb stopped on the steps, pulled her toward him, and kissed her. Right there on the sidewalk, slow and soft and real. 30 days to the minute from the day he'd first walked into her bookstore. The deal was over, and neither of them wanted it to end. That night, he met her at the bookstore after closing. The lights were dim, the old floorboards creaking under their shoes, and the scent of old paper hung warm in the quiet. He had a small paper bag with him, and he set it on the counter between the poetry section and the cash register. 30 days, he said. Contracts expired. June traced the edge of the counter with a finger. She was wearing the cheap fake ring he'd given her, the one she'd almost thrown away after the fight about the blueprints. It felt silly now. "Shame," she said, smiling a little. "I was just getting used to having a fiancé." He reached into the bag and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it. Inside was a thin silver band set with a tiny deep blue sapphire. Simple. Quiet. Perfect. "I got you a real one," he said. "No contract, no deadlines, no hidden clauses. Just, if you want it, a real engagement. For real this time." June looked from the ring to his face. His dark eyes were soft, nervous almost, like he actually thought she might say no. She thought about the eviction notice, about the fake dinners, about the fight that had almost broken everything. She thought about her grandma, about lemon drops and story time, about the way this store had held every good thing in her life. She thought about how the best things never started the way you planned. "Yes," she said. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. 6 months later, Page Turner celebrated its 40th anniversary. The coffee shop next door was open, run by Lila, and the artist studios above were fully rented to local poets, illustrators, and novelists. The old brick building still stood, same as it always had, but brighter now, fuller, humming with life. June was restocking the poetry shelf one Saturday afternoon when Caleb walked in with 2 iced lattes. He kissed her on the cheek, set her drink down, and leaned against the counter beside her. A group of kids sat cross-legged on the storytime rug, listening to a volunteer read picture books. Outside, the sun shone down on the street. "Your grandma would be proud," he said. June smiled. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and for a second, she could almost smell her grandma's lemon drops, almost hear her laugh. She'd walked into that first deal trying to save a bookstore. She'd ended up saving a neighborhood, building something new, and finding a love she'd never dared to look for. Somewhere above the shelves, tucked between 2 old poetry collections, was the first book her grandma had ever given her. On the inside cover, in wobbly cursive, it said, "The best stories don't follow the map." June looked up at Caleb, at the man who'd started as her enemy and become her everything, and she knew her grandma had been right. The best stories never do. The 7 days before the trust board meeting blurred into a haze of blueprints, coffee cups, and late nights in the back room of Page Turner's. June and Caleb worked side by side every evening after the shop closed, spreading renderings across the old oak table, lining up tenant letters and community petitions along the bookshelves. What had started as a frantic defense of the store slowly turned into something bigger, a real plan, built by both of them, for the neighborhood they both loved. Caleb had expected to fight this battle with spreadsheets and legal briefs. He had not expected to fight it with handwritten notes. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning. A city fire inspector showed up at the door, clipboard in hand, saying an anonymous complaint had been filed about blocked exit routes and outdated wiring. He gave them 72 hours to fix a list of violations, or the shop would be temporarily shut down. June knew immediately who was behind it. Torres was squeezing her, trying to make her fold before the hearing. Caleb's first instinct was to call his lawyer, pay for a top-tier electrical crew to work through the night, and make the problem disappear by morning. June stopped him before he picked up the phone. "No," she said, leaning against the front counter. "If we throw money at this, he wins. He gets to say we bought our way out of trouble, that we don't belong here. So what do?" He said, "Wait 3 days and let him shut you down?" "Better idea," she said, already grabbing a stack of flyers from under the counter. "We show him how many people care about this store." By the end of the day, the word had spread. Retired teachers from the elementary school down the street showed up with toolboxes to help clear the back storage room. A local electrician, who'd had his first story time at Page Turner's when he was 5, came by after work and rewired the front display case for free. Regulars brought sandwiches and coffee, stayed to help organize shelves, and signed a petition supporting the store. By closing time, they had 200 signatures and a fully compliant safety report. Caleb stood by the front door that night, watching a group of high school kids carry boxes of old books down to the basement for storage, and something shifted in his chest. He'd spent years thinking of real estate as just numbers, square footage, rent rolls, return on investment. He'd forgotten that buildings weren't just walls and roofs. They were where people lived their lives, see? June said, coming to stand beside him. She was tired, her hair falling loose from its ponytail, but she was smiling. "This is what the store is. It's not just mine. It's everyone's." He looked down at her, at the way the warm lamplight hit her face, and for a second he forgot how to breathe. He'd come here 30 days ago with a contract and a plan. He'd never planned for this, never planned to care. Later, when everyone had left and the store was quiet, he went out to his car and brought back a worn leather journal from the glove box. He set it on the counter between them. "My grandma's," he said. "I found it when I was cleaning out her house after she died. I never really read it all the way through until last week." June opened it carefully. The pages were yellowed, the handwriting looping and neat. Most of it was ordinary. Grocery lists, garden notes, stories about Caleb as a little boy. But tucked in the middle was an entry from 10 years prior, about page turners. "That little bookstore on the corner is the heart of this block," the entry read. "The developers keep making offers, but I won't sell. Not to someone who'll just tear it down. Someday I hope Caleb understands. Buildings make money. Communities make a life." June looked up, her throat tight. She never wanted to tear it down. "No," Caleb said, quiet. "She didn't, and I almost did. Almost became the guy she didn't want me to be." "You didn't," she said. She reached across the counter and covered his hand with hers. "You're not that guy." He flipped her hand over and laced their fingers together. It was the first time they'd held hands on purpose. Not for show, not for an audience. Just because they wanted to. The shop was quiet around them, the old books warm in the dark, the streetlight glowing through the front window. "I meant what I said," he said, after a long silence, "about wanting this to be real. About wanting you." June's heart skipped. She'd replayed his confession in her head 100 times since that afternoon. But hearing it again, quiet and honest in the dim bookstore, felt different. Felt permanent. "I meant it too," she said. He leaned in then, slow, like he was giving her time to pull away. She didn't pull away. She leaned in too. And when he kissed her, it was soft and slow, and nothing like the quick, performative kisses they'd shared for family dinners. This was real. This was theirs. The moment broke when her phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up, unknown number. The text was short, cold, and sharp. "Nice petition drive. Too bad I have something better. See you tomorrow." M.T. Torres. Caleb's jaw tightened when he read it. "He's bluffing." "Is he?" June said. She looked out the window at the dark street, at the snow dusting the sidewalk. "He already tried the fire inspection. What else does he have?" "I don't know," Caleb said. He squeezed her hand. "But whatever it is, we handle it together. Same as today." He walked her up to her apartment above the store an hour later, journal tucked under his arm, their revised development plan in his other hand. They stood on the landing for a long time, not talking, just standing there, like neither of them wanted the night to end. "Tomorrow's gonna be hard," June said finally. "I know," he said, "but we're gonna win." He kissed her one more time, soft and quick, before he left. She leaned back against her front door after he was gone, her fingers resting on her lips, and tried to steady her breathing. 30 days ago, he'd walked into her store with an eviction notice and a ridiculous proposal. She'd thought it was a bluff. She'd thought he was the enemy. Now he was the person she was going to war with. The person she was starting to love. Somewhere down the street, a car door closed. Somewhere inside the building, an old floorboard creaked. And somewhere across town, Mr. Torres was putting together his final play. Tomorrow, everything would be decided.